Everybody's ready to go? Okay, good morning everyone. I want to acknowledge and recognize that we are on Treaty 1 territory. This land is the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and the national homeland of the Red River Métis. Thank you for coming this morning. My name is Sergeant Paul Manaigre, and I'm a Media Relations Officer for the Manitoba RCMP. I will provide my remarks in English first, and then in French, after which I will take questions from you. I'd like to acknowledge that what we're going to discuss in today's press conference is in relation to Indian residential schools and could be upsetting or traumatizing to members of the public. Yesterday, June 16th, 2022, Manitoba RCMP Major Crime Services investigators arrested retired father Arthur Masse, 92 years of age, at his residence in Winnipeg on a charge of indecent assault in relation to a sexual assault that occurred more than 50 years ago. The victim of the assault was a 10-year-old female student of Fort Alexander Residential School, where Masse was employed. The offense occurred between 1968 and 1970. This arrest is a culmination of a decade of work by RCMP investigators who would not have been able to bring this to a conclusion without the incredible bravery of the victims and witnesses who were willing to relive past trauma and speak about what took place. In February 2010, allegations of sexual abuse at the Fort Alexander Residential School were made to the Manitoba RCMP's Major Crime Services. Investigators began to gather information to determine what took place as well as the scope of the occurrences. A criminal investigation was launched in 2011. Officers conducted archival research and spoke to or interacted with more than 700 people across North America throughout this investigation in an effort to locate any possible victims or witnesses. Investigators combed through thousands of documents, including student lists, employee lists, and quarterly returns in order to identify any possible victims. In total, 75 witness and victim statements were obtained by police. More than 80 RCMP investigators have been engaged with this investigation. The question may be asked, why, with all this work, was there one charge laid and not many? Unfortunately, due to the passage of time, many of the victims are not able to participate in the investigation, whether that be for mental or physical health reasons, or because the victim is now deceased. The RCMP was very aware of the effect our investigation was having on the community. The emotional trauma experienced by victims of abuse is very real, and despite the years that have intervened between the alleged occurrences and when police were investigating, that trauma was still present. Investigators were aware of that trauma and approached the investigation in a way intended to limit further injury. We made sure any potential victims were given the time they needed to consider their options and whether they wanted to relive their trauma by providing statements and potentially going through the court process. We also engaged with First Nations leadership in Manitoba, including the Grand Chiefs of the Assembly of Manitoba Chiefs and the Southern Chiefs Organization, and the Chief and Council of Sag King First Nation, the community most closely affected by this investigation. At this time, Masse has been released with conditions and will appear in court on July 20th, 2022. This is the only investigation into residential schools underway by the Manitoba RCMP. With this charge, the investigation has been concluded. If anyone else comes forward to speak to police, we will absolutely follow up, but we are not actively investigating any further at this time. There is no time limit to report a sexual assault to police. If you wish to report a sexual assault, you can contact your local police to make a report, or you can report the crime through a third party such as clinic community health. In being here today and speaking to you about this investigation, we are certainly not trying to make this about the RCMP and the work done by investigators. Our focus today, as it has always been, is the victims of crime. The victim in this case has endured a lot throughout the investigative process and has stood firm in speaking out about what happened to her. The most important thing to her today is she was heard. Now I'll provide the same in French, one moment, and then I'll take any questions. Bonjour. Je tiens d'abord à souligner que nous trouvons sur des terres visées par le traité numéro 1, qui constitue le territoire traditionnel des peuples Anishinaabe, Cree, Ojibwe, Dakota et Dene, ainsi que la terre ancestrale des Métis de la Rivière-Rouge. Merci d'être avec nous aujourd'hui. Je me présente, Sergent Paul Manaigre, agent des relations avec les médias de la GRC au Manitoba. J'aimerais préciser que ce dont nous allons parler lors de la conférence de presse aujourd'hui est en rapport avec les pensionnats autochtones et pourrait être perturbant ou traumatisant pour certaines personnes parmi le public. Hier, le 16 juin, les enquêteurs des services des crimes majeurs de la GRC ont arrêté l'ancien abbé Arthur Masse, âgé de 92 ans, à sa résidence de Winnipeg pour attendre à la pudeur en lien avec une agression sexuelle survenue il y a plus de 50 ans. La victime de l'agression était une enfant de 10 ans, élève du pensionnat autochtone de Fort Alexander, où travaillait l'abbé Masse. L'infraction a été commise entre 1068 et 1070. Cette arrestation représente l'aboutissement d'une décennie de travail de la part des enquêteurs de la GRC. Ceci n'aura toutefois pas pu faire aboutir l'enquête sans la participation des victimes et des témoins, qui ont fait preuve d'une incroyable bravoure en acceptant de parler de ce qu'ils ont vécu et de revivre leur traumatisme. En février 2010, les allégations de violence sexuelle au pensionnat autochtone de Fort Alexander ont été faites auprès des services des crimes majeurs de la GRC au Manitoba. Les enquêteurs ont alors commencé à recueillir des renseignements pour déterminer la nature et l'envergure des événements. On a ouvert une enquête criminelle en 2011. Les agents ont effectué des recherches dans les archives et communiqué avec plus de 700 personnes en Amérique du Nord au cours de l'enquête pour trouver des victimes ou des témoins potentiels. Les enquêteurs ont passé en revue des milliers de documents, notamment des listes d'élèves et d'employés et des relevés trimestriels afin de repérer toute victime potentielle. En tout, la police a recueilli 75 déclarations de la part de victimes et de témoins. Plus de 80 enquêteurs de la GRC ont participé à cette enquête. Vous vous demandez peut-être, après tous ces efforts, pourquoi n'avons-nous pas porté plus d'une accusation? Malheureusement, compte tenu du temps qui s'est écoulé depuis, bon nombre de victimes n'ont pas été en mesure de participer à l'enquête, que ce soit pour des raisons de santé mentale ou physique, ou parce qu'elles sont aujourd'hui décédées. La GRC était très sensible aux effets de son enquête sur la collectivité. Les traumatismes émotionnels que vivent les victimes de violences sont tout à fait réels. Et malgré les années qui se sont écoulées entre les faits allégués et le moment où l'enquête suivait son cours, ces traumatismes sont toujours présents. Les enquêteurs, conscients de ces traumatismes, ont mené l'enquête de façon à éviter de causer plus de tort. Nous avons veillé à ce que les victimes potentielles aient le temps d'évaluer leurs options et de le déterminer si elles acceptaient de revivre ce traumatisme dans le cadre des déclarations qu'elles auraient à faire et de leur éventuelle participation à la procédure judiciaire. Nous avons également consulté les dirigeants des Premières Nations du Manitoba, y compris les grands chefs de l'Assemblée des chefs du Manitoba et de l'Organisation des chefs du Sud, ainsi que la chef et le conseil de la Première Nation Saïki, qui est la collectivité la plus touchée par l'enquête. À l'heure actuelle, l'abbé Masse a été mis en liberté sous condition et doit comparaître en justice le 20 juillet 2022. Il s'agit de la seule enquête sur les pensionnats autochtones de la GRC au Manitoba en cours. Cette accusation met fin à l'enquête. Nous ferons un suivi auprès de toute autre personne qui communiquera avec nous à ce sujet, mais sachez que nous ne menons pas d'enquête active à l'heure actuelle. Il n'y a pas de délai prescrit pour signaler une agression sexuelle à la police. Si vous le souhaitez, vous pouvez signaler une agression sexuelle à votre service de police local ou le signaler par l'entremise d'une tierce partie comme l'organisme Clinic Community Health. Bien que nous soyons ici pour vous parler de cette enquête, nous ne souhaitons pas attirer l'attention sur la GRC et le travail des enquêteurs. Notre attention, comme toujours, se porte sur les victimes d'actes criminels. Le processus d'enquête a été très éprouvant pour la victime dans cette affaire, qui a tenu bon en racontant ce que lui est arrivé. Elle a été entendue. Merci. If you have any questions?
75 il y a eu 75 déclarations, une seule accusation. Combien de victimes on pense que la démarche a pu faire au cours des années?
Bien, on a trouvé d'autres victimes, mais il y avait des choses entre nous qui ne voulaient pas participer ou il n'y avait pas assez d'évidence.
Et combien de personnes on pense qui ont peut-être été victimes de la démarche?
Bien, on n'a pas un nombre spécifique, mais comme on a dit, on a parlé avec 75, possiblement des témoins et des victimes.
You said there were 75 witness and victim statements, plus some victims that possibly had already passed away. Can you give us an idea of how many possible victims there were in this case total?
Well, we can't come to a specific number. Say, with the archival research, like they say, we were able to kind of come with 75 people that we're able to identify and speak with. There could have been others, but unfortunately some may have been deceased. In terms of suspects, it's the same principle. There's either not enough evidence or the suspects were deceased as well.
Do you believe there were more victims?
Sorry?
There were other potential suspects you were looking at?
Yes.
Il y avait d'autres suspects, parlez-moi. L'abbé Masse, est-ce qu'il serait seul?
Non, il n'était pas le seul. Il y avait d'autres suspects, mais comme je dis, il n'y avait pas d'assez... au moins, ils ne voulaient pas participer avec les témoins ou il y avait l'enquête, ce n'est pas permis pour les chefs.
Do you believe there were other victims in regards to this priest?
We spoke with a potential amount of victims, and then, like I say, the investigation led us to the charge, where it's the victims wanting to come forward and speak with us, and that's what allowed us to lay this charge.
Can you talk about a specific charge? It's not one we've heard of quite often. What does this specific charge mean?
Well, the charge, say you're looking back now at the criminal code back in at that time, the sexual assault offense was not in place. At that time, it was an indecent assault.
So why charged with what it was at the time?
Yes, at the time of the offense, that was the criminal charge has to be laid at that time.
So why one count if you consider there might be more victims or you spoke with other possible victims?
Sorry, say it again?
Why just one count if you have other possible victims you spoke with?
Well, regarding those victims, like I say, those victims either have to be willing to participate or there has to be the corroborating evidence. Right now, we put the package together that allowed us to lay the charge for this one victim that was willing to participate.
Was he a priest at the time of these offenses, and what was his role at the school?
He was an employee at that time in the First Nations community. As far as his role, I guess as a priest, I don't know if he was a teacher, but he was employed and working on the First Nation.
Pourquoi un seul chef d'accusation? Pourquoi t'entends la pudeur? On avait parlé un petit peu en anglais, là. On parle d'un chef d'accusation de l'époque. Expliquez-moi pourquoi un seul chef et pourquoi ce chef-là spécifiquement?
Bien, le chef, aujourd'hui, ça s'applique à une situation en 1068. Il n'y avait pas de chef d'une agression sexuelle. En 78, ça s'appelait un indecent assault. So, le chef s'applique dans l'année où l'incident s'est effectué.
Mais pourquoi un seul chef alors qu'on parle de 75 déclarations?
Bien, on va avec ce qu'on trouve avec l'enquête, puis avec les avocats, c'est ce qu'on a décidé, on peut continuer avec une charge.
This was a massive investigation that spanned a decade. Are you guys pleased with the charge that you were able to lay? Are you disappointed you weren't able to lay more? Can you just speak a little bit about the investigation and the outcome?
I won't speak to whether we're pleased or displeased. Today it's for the victim. She needs to be heard. She's been strong. She's cooperated. We're working on her behalf. She needs to be heard. I'm hoping her story is going to come out and she's going to get the justice that she's asking for. So whether or not we work hard, regardless, you can imagine 10 years going through archival documents is a massive undertaking. So for her, we would wish we could speak for more victims, but like I say, in the end, we're working for the victims. Whether or not they want to participate, we leave that decision with them because this is a traumatizing experience. Some of them don't want to relive it, we understand. So we're representing them.
To your knowledge, is this the only charge Manitoba RCMP have ever laid in relation to abuses?
At this time, this is the only investigation undertaking regarding residential schools, and this is the only charge at this time.
On est satisfait du résultat de l'enquête, une seule accusation. On est satisfait d'agir ça?
Bien, on est satisfait pour les victimes. Aujourd'hui, elle est entendue.
How old was the priest at the time of the offenses estimated was?
Well, if you do the math, he's 92 today. Back in 68, that would be, I can't do the math. He'd be younger, so.
Pour quelle congrégation il travaillait, on sait? Est-ce qu'on sait pour quelle congrégation religieuse il travaillait à la démence?
Non, moi je peux pas répondre à cette question.
Survivors have been telling their stories since this has started happening. Can you really boil it down? Why did this take a decade to lay a charge when survivors have come out over and over and shared their vulnerabilities and their traumas?
Well, I think speaking on behalf of how the investigation unfolded, as you can see, it took approximately 80 officers, the amount of work, like I say, going all over North America. You've got to track down student list, you've got to track down employee list. It's not just a one-stop, show up at a building, here's all your information, the amount of work it would take, and then identifying possible victims, witnesses, trying to track them down, trying to interview them, explaining the process. They're not just going to approach you and speak to you the first time. They have to understand what they're undertaking, because this is massive. Like I say, you're reliving past traumas from 50 years ago. Some of them might not want to bring this up. They need time to decide. So now you've got a massive undertaking with others, so you kind of move forward and try and get everybody on the same page, try and get those statements. Now you have the information, you've got to go back now, start corroborating. Can you piece it together with the list you've obtained? I can't imagine the volumes of work, the paperwork, just to have to look at, never mind before you're even contemplating laying charges. So it's a massive undertaking.
Can
I ask,
one-time offense?
can I ask, just to go back, is it the RCMP's belief that there likely is, or would have been, more charges, more suspects, and even more charges with this suspect, but because of the passage of time, people have died, both potential suspects and victims, people not willing to participate. Based on all the evidence over 10 years that the RCMP looked at, if this was not 50 plus years old, that maybe there would have been more charges, more suspects. Is that fair?
That would be fair to say, yes. With the passage of time, like you say, you got people that are unwilling, no longer with us, suspects that are no longer with us. It's just, that's kind of what you're working against. So they had to put this all together and present it to the Crown, and ultimately they have to decide, can we move forward with this? And with our one victim, she was very adamant, wanted to proceed, and here we are today.
Was this a one-time offense, or is it believed that there were multiple occurrences of this offense with this victim?
Sorry, say it again, Brittany?
Was this a one-time indecent assault, or is it believed that it happened multiple times during that time period?
I don't have the specifics, if it was a one-time or more. The only information I have is it occurred within a 2-year span.
Now that a charge has been laid, just given other historical assaults, how likely is it that more survivors will come to RCMP and try to have charges laid in their cases?
Well, that's very much a possibility. With one coming forward, some having the courage, you might have others. As we stated, if this investigation itself is concluded, but if others come forward, we will investigate those claims and move forward with any investigation that comes out of it. So like we mentioned, if anyone has information they want to come forward, there's ways either through third party or they can come directly to the RCMP, and we will investigate any claims that come forward.
Pourquoi est-ce que ça a pris 10 ans à mener cette enquête-là? Pourquoi ça a été aussi long avant de déposer une
Ben,
accusation?
si tu regardes comme le montant des documents, les endroits que les enquêteurs y ont parti pour prendre des renseignements des témoins, des victimes, le montant d'ouvrage qu'il y avait devant les enquêteurs, c'était immense. Donc, ça a dû prendre du temps pour préparer les témoins, pour préparer les documents, pour même faire certain que c'est prêt pour le coup.
Can you say what sparked this particular investigation for this school? Because we've heard, allegations of abuse at many schools. Why this one in particular? And are you going to now look at other ones?
Well, my understanding is an allegation came forward, and as it is the practice of the RCMP, investigations are launched. In the beginning was kind of a probing allegation to determine the extent of it, which within, I guess, that year, it was determined that this could be big. There's the amount of work that was involved, so then that planning process had to be put in place. And, for an investigation of this magnitude, what do you need? Like I said, when you're looking at 80 investigators, not just from Winnipeg, but probably with assistance from across Canada and perhaps various police agencies in the United States. The magnitude is huge.
Is it the largest investigation undertaken by Manitoba RCMP?
I don't know. It would be one of them.
In terms of this investigation, when you found the information that led to a suspect who is deceased, what do you do with that information going forward? Can you still use it to try and bring justice? Does it just stop being investigated? Like, what happens with that information?
Well, like any investigation, you want to try and put all the pieces of the puzzle together. Yes, you might have a suspect that's deceased and that part leads cold, but it can help corroborate other victim stories. Like, you just don't stop. You got to put it all out there. Yes, one lane might end, but it could help open doors to others. So you got to keep it open and put it all together.
Did you work with the Catholic Church or the Oblates on this investigation, and were they compliant with providing information?
As far as I don't know. It would have been, obviously the dialogue would have been provided, so that they understand where we're coming from. We would have respected, what they needed from us. But in the end, like I say, it's an investigation we needed to carry forward. There were certain things we would need, and we would act on that.
Did they provide documents?
I would understand, like I say, through archival. I can't answer that directly.
Was anything extra done with, in terms of trauma counseling, or a difference in how you guys investigated this when dealing with the alleged victims and witnesses?
We would want to make sure that all the available options are available to the victims, because you can understand the magnitude of this trauma. If it's been buried for 50 years, we're asking to relive it. We want to make sure those resources are in place.
En français maintenant, est-ce qu'on s'attend à ce que cet exemple-là, ce dossier-là, ouvre la voie à d'autres victimes de d'autres pensionnats à peut-être se confier. Est-ce qu'on s'attend à d'autres enquêtes auprès de la GRC maintenant que ce dossier-là est terminé?
Absolument, c'est une possibilité que ça ouvre la porte pour d'autres enquêtes. Si ça rentre, on va prendre l'information, puis s'il y a quelque chose qu'on peut faire, une enquête va être ouverte.
Does the victim still reside in Manitoba?
I'm not sure, I don't have that information.
So when you say across North America, I mean, is this involving investigators traveling to the United States to talk to witnesses, victims, potential suspects? What does that mean exactly?
That's a possibility. They haven't told me directly, but I would assume that we would require assistance from other agencies, depending on what the request is. If we needed to speak to someone directly, our investigators would have attended. If it's something another agency could assist with, kind of like any other investigation, we send that request out to our partners.
But
Do
those
you
there were.
Do you know if any other individuals who worked at the school, are they alive? This person's 92, so I'm just wondering if RCMP, if there are other people who were there that were either suspected or interviewed, or potential witnesses, I suppose. Is anybody else alive? They get that you know.
Well, that's all the sources of information they would have focused on, who's still around, and like I say, anyone that could have had information would have been attempted to be spoken to, trying to perhaps obtain further information as perhaps a witness, a suspect. All those avenues, like I say, that's why you're going through the archives to say who's around, who was there at the time, who could be available today to help us.
Some relationship between some First Nations people and different police services is tense, to say the least, for some. How did officers approach building trust with survivors and other people who may have given information?
Of course, it's a delicate balance that you have to take into consideration when you're asking them possibly to relive this trauma. So it's very important to open that dialogue, to explain what we're trying to do. So we're asking them to participate. You can't force them. If they want to join us in helping them seek justice, that's what we're asking. So you want to give them that information and let them make that decision. It's not a decision they're going to take lightly or make immediately. They need that time. So that's why, like I say, the process takes time. Could be 6 months between the person wanting to speak, it could be 3 years. You have to let them make that decision, and then if they are willing, you help guide them through the process.
So was there
We'll
anything...
take 2 more questions, okay?
Okay, I won't ask that. Can you just explain the indecent assault charge one more time? Like, will that be... How will that play out in the courts? I'm just not clear. Like, will it be seen as a sexual assault charge now? I just think when people hear indecent assault, I mean, I don't really understand how, like, this serious...
Well, the charge will relate to how the law was written back in 1968 in terms of what elements of the offense do you need to prove it. The mitigating circumstances are going to be laid out. So whether or not it meets the elements, that's what the courts will decide. And then whatever the outcome, all the information will still be present. Whether it's called today's charge or with the charge in 1968. For us, we're trying to prove those elements of the offense.
So the name of the charge is just kind of like, it's not an aside, but it won't matter in court. Like, they'll look at the evidence.
Yeah, obviously, like I said, we're putting our evidence forward. One last question.
On peut juste répéter en français parce que vous avez un peu bafouillé la première question. Qu'est-ce qui explique qu'on a vraiment qu'une seule accusation? Vous disiez en français là, que pardon, y a des victimes qui ne voulaient pas parler ou qui sont décédées. Il faudrait peut-être reprendre cette clip-là, s'il vous plaît. Pourquoi on a une seule accusation?
Au sujet de la seule accusation?
Ouais, pourquoi on en a juste une alors qu'on a eu plein de victimes?
Bien, au sujet, comme on a dit, on a parlé avec 75 personnes, il y avait des témoins, des victimes. Puis l'idée, c'est de trouver les seuls qui veulent travailler avec la police. Il y a plusieurs personnes qui ont parlé avec la police, mais c'est-tu possible qu'on n'avait pas de preuves? C'est pas juste assez si, OK, on va juste parler, on dit quelque chose. Il faut qu'on voit tout le processus, on a la preuve pour l'accusation. Pour la femme aujourd'hui, on avait assez pour laisser l'accusation. Y a-t-il plusieurs victimes? Absolument. Y a-t-il d'autres suspects? Oui. Mais c'est pour mettre tout ensemble, il y avait juste assez pour une accusation.
Can you say whether he was working in his capacity as an employee when the alleged offenses took place?
I can only say he was on the First Nations community acting as an employee. I don't know as what his role was. I haven't provided that.
And so, to be clear, an employee of the First Nation or of the school?
Of the residential school at the time.
These assaults and allegations took place decades ago. It took a decade for police to do this investigation. We're talking about people who are 90 years old or have passed away. When people come forward now talking specifically about assaults that took place at residential schools, the timeline that we're working with, I mean, very soon it's going to be so long that justice may never be served. Does that change the way investigators look at this information or the pace that you need to move at when you look into these crimes?
It doesn't change the way we do it. In policing, you have an investigation or an allegation that's brought to you, you have a process to follow. To put a matter before the courts, you need evidence, you need victims that are willing to testify. Obviously, with the age and the timing, of course, you got an urgency, but we can't rush certain things to put all that work into it and then fail at the end. The idea is to put your best foot forward, and like I say, like any investigations we do in the RCMP, you have a process, investigators follow, the best practices always come out, and then like I say, if there's a lot of work, you bring in more investigators. Like I say, our major crime services, this is their role, their mandate, and they presented to what they had, and this is where we are today. That's it. Thank you very much.
Masse, un accent aigu, on est dans les archives, on a accent